Hi, let's go on to the next session. It is on SBOM and supply chain security, a practitioner's perspective. This is a subject that's top of mind for many of you, I'm sure. One where there is a lot of new regulations coming in, one where there are several big challenges for the enterprises. So hosting this particular session are two speakers. We have Cassie Crossley, who's VP of Cybersecurity, Product Security Office, and Supply Chain Security at Schneider Electric. Schneider, Cassie Crossley, he's a foremost expert in this. I have known her for several years now, and I know she's been talking about SBOM even before SBOM became as popular as it is right now. So she comes from a place of deep expertise in this space. And she also is actually involved with the regulatory work some of you might be seeing in the industry out there. And the second speaker for this is Varun Badhwar, who is CEO and founder of Endor Labs, a company that is at the forefront of solving some of your supply chain challenges. It helps you deal with the alerts so that the developers can focus on developing and not get drowned in the alerts that come. Before this, Varun was SVP and GM at Palo Alto Networks, Prisma Cloud business. And before that, he was CEO and founder at Redlock. So here you have a very accomplished speakers and experts sharing their perspective about supply chain security.
Hello and welcome everyone to today's session on SBOMs and supply chains, a practitioner's perspective. I'm Varun Badhwar, founder and CEO of Endor Labs, where we're really focused on the heart of this problem that we're going to spend a lot of time on today. And I'm thrilled to be joined by Cassie. Cassie, welcome.
Hi, I'm Cassie Crossley. I'm the Vice President for Supply Chain Security at Schneider Electric's Cybersecurity and Product Security Office. And you may know Schneider Electric if you have heard of some of our brand names such as AVEVA or 𝗲𝗄𝗄𝗏 or APC if you work with data centers. Glad to be here.
Great, Cassie. I'm excited for this chat. And why don't I first turn it over to you to talk about SBOMs?
All right. So I come from a developer background, and when I first started creating software, no one knew what we put in it. We also didn't have open source back at that time. But as you're writing, the different code or now bringing in open source projects or packages or anything, there, as I'm sure everyone knows, there's a level of transparency that you may not know of what's in your software. And so this transparency that we can get from software bill of materials allows us to see the various libraries and packages included. And some SBOMs actually will include those additional levels, what's called transitive dependencies. What that means is that if I include a library maybe from a commercial supplier, it would also be able to show you the libraries that are in that software library. So you get multiple levels in a software bill of materials. It may come as a sort of a flat view if you're just looking at a PDF version, but we've got some different formats that Varun will talk about later. So at Schneider Electric, we determined from our different use cases, when we were first looking at software bill of materials, we were looking at it from an internal perspective and how could we use it to make decisions, reduce dependencies, work on compliance and monitoring and tracking. But as our customers have asked for that transparency into the products, we've seen a lot of use cases where they're wanting to also be able to identify those vulnerabilities in case they want to put mitigations in place. And there's also ways for them to be able to verify licensing, look at the integration. So there's a lot on that level. And then at the operational view. So we personally right now are getting a lot more requests from a procurement standpoint, just really trying to understand our architecture. But as other tools evolve and can ingest SBOMs. I really expect that to see ways for it to be alerting, being able to use VEX, which Varun will talk about later, but being able to make decisions that they aren't able to make quickly at this time without that transparent information in the SBOM and VEX.
Now, Cassie, thank you so much for talking about why SBOMs are critical in the spirit of transparency. But the big question in my mind always is, great, you produce an artifact, you've checked a box, whether it's you internally doing it for your applications or your vendors doing it for you. But for me, the big question is it actually useful? How accurate is it? And I think the important things to understand and why we say SBOM is a means to an end is because at the end of the day, what these bombs are showing you is what kinds of software do you rely on? And Cassie made an important point about transitive dependencies. I don't think most people appreciate, but on average, when your developers are bringing in one open source software component from the internet, it is bringing with it 77 other packages, which we're not paying a lot of attention to. And so the bomb is ultimately reflecting your practices, your governance process on what comes in. Why? Because once your customer scans it and figures out that, oh, you're using something that's 17 releases behind, that doesn't show well on you and your practices. Or why are you using a piece of code that is suspicious in nature? How come you didn't know about it? Why did I have to tell you about it? And so, with transparency comes the obligation to do more in the process to make sure everything from the selection, management, and maintenance of open source software is done well. The second piece becomes a function of how much data is appropriate. Like, do you just share the top level dependencies and put it on your customers to do the work to figure out everything else beneath it? Do you actually include your test dependencies? Do you include any context about the things where you have unfixed issues and findings that I would likely find if I scan your SBOM? Why you chose to not fix something? And ultimately, the thing that we as an industry are completely unprepared for is in this information exchange, when my customers come back after scanning my bomb and ask me 1,000 questions on a spreadsheet of, well, my scanner is telling me you have all of these problems. What are you going to do about it? We are just not staffed and prepared to actually handle that ecosystem. More importantly, actually, the consumers of SBOMs are not prepared to consume these SBOMs in any form or fashion of automation for analysis and prioritization. So the thing that people often forget is there is a very important companion document to an SBOM. This standard called VEX was also created by the NTIA, the same body that provided the context of SBOMs. And it's a bit like peanut butter and jelly. An SBOM without a VEX is useless because while an SBOM lists out the different versions of open source components you're using, what it doesn't tell somebody who is consuming that SBOM is, well, in what way and form are you using it based on which issues apply or don't apply to you? So it carries the context to say, let me preemptively tell you why we chose not to fix certain vulnerabilities, why we're comfortable with certain issues. It's whether you're using a dependency, is it impacting you? Is there a fix available? All of that context is carried in a VEX. And the important thing is, if you give somebody an SBOM without a VEX, expect to get overwhelmed and inundated with lots and lots of questions that you will have to go back and forth with. Although the VEX sounds so good and impactful, why isn't it widely adopted is the common question I get. Well, the problem is that manually creating a VEX document is impractical at scale. But unfortunately, in the industry, there's hundreds of tools to help you generate an SBOM. That's the easy part. To annotate that with all of the VEX context is a lot harder. And today, most of the organization's expectations are that developers would manually annotate your Cyclone DX files or whatever your SBOM format is with the VEX context. But that would be thousands and thousands of engineering hours spent on it. So automation is key. And that's an area that Endor Labs has certainly been putting a lot of research and effort into. And we're happy to kind of share that that is something that you can automate through our platform. But I think the most important takeaway here is organizations need to understand how to have systems and processes in place to do this. Cassie, I'll turn it back over to you to talk about the workflows.
Yes, and I want to add a couple of comments on what you were just saying. Let me give you an image. For example, Schneider Electric, 15,000 intelligent products. So imagine how many SBOMs that I have going on at a point in time. I've got, I believe, one of the largest collections around of SBOMs. So imagine Log4j, which had two main CVEs. So 15,000 SBOMs, not including all the different versions, and then two CVEs. So you take those two CVEs and imagine if you just want to have one response to the latest version of those products, I'm looking at 30,000 objects. So from a capability to be able to do this on a mass scale, it is quite a lot. And I think that especially what you were saying, Varun, is at this point in time, just trying to get the SBOMs available and, for our customers and making sure that they're accurate is a large challenge. But being able to respond, what I consider more to even just focusing on the known exploitability vulnerabilities, those CVEs, the KEVs, it's really important. And when we're looking at Schneider Electric in this logic flow, I've got not only the SBOMs that are coming in from our own proprietary code that we're developing, but I've got third-party provider code. So let's say I've got a real-time operating system, or I have those commercial libraries I mentioned earlier. Those are all, I've got to bring them all together in addition to open source code.
Yeah, and while you're taking a sip of water there, I think what people need to appreciate is commonly everybody here is using a software composition analysis tool. These tools generate millions of alerts at an organization of your size and scale. And so the prioritization, whether it's based on exploitability or reachability or impact of the asset criticality, is so important. And I think as an industry, we are so far behind in having the right practices and tooling and automation to bring that automation down. Because what research has shown is with that prioritization, you could actually shave off 90 to 95% of the noise generated by these types of composition analysis tools and focus on the 5 or 10% of the things that really matter. Because to your point, with 15,000 applications, that is the only way to do this, or 90% of your engineering time will be spent chasing vulnerabilities.
That's right. And one of the items that I really think that SBOMs are going to do is be able to give us some focus and work on some of this tech debt that we have in place. You mentioned about having different versions. I'm not going to be able to help if those open source packages have different versions within them of different packages, but at a minimum proprietary usage, if I have a group using 3 different versions of OpenSSL, that's not practical. Let's get that cleaned up. But also, we're as a development industry, more has been better up to this point, and we have a lot of code bloat. And the SBOMs will also, I believe, help us really focus on, do you need that? Are you using it at runtime? Are you ever using it? Because if you imported from that project, it had 10,000 lines of code and you're only using 500, we sort of kept that other 9,500 around. So I think that the SBOM and really having, as you said, the 70 plus packages, you don't need them all. And we're not being efficient in some of those decisions that we make as developers as we bring those in.
Yeah, it's funny, I was speaking to a large bank a few weeks ago, and they said, wouldn't it be nice if I could just have a dedicated dependency or removal engineer? Because, developers love to bring things in, but we're refactoring our code all the time. And when somebody changes having a dependency, well, it's still imported technically in your manifest file, but it's not used in the application. And that's just bloat. That's us chasing vulnerabilities and upgrades on stuff we don't care about. But today, most people are lacking the tooling to do that. So, you bring up a really good point there. I wanted to kind of bring all of what Cassie and I have talked together in one frame. And I think as an industry, the nirvana state that we all need to try to shift towards or get towards eventually is we're all Everybody is a software company, whether you're a bank or a retailer or a healthcare or a software provider, you're building software. And so the left-hand side of the practices as producers of software would require you to make sure you have a good, sustainable, high-quality program to generate SBOMs, generate these VECs we talked about in a very sustainable manner. The thing below that is equally important because, as we talked about, you get millions of alerts through these different types of tools and bomb scanning capabilities. You've got to easily communicate with your internal stakeholders and your external stakeholders what truly affects you and what you're doing or have already done about it, and be able to cut through the 80 or 90% of the noise. And that requires a lot of capabilities that go beyond just scanning for manifest files the way most SCA tools do today. So whether you build internal programs, you look for augmenting tools, whatever that might be. The right-hand side of this is equally important. I can't tell you how many conversations I have where organizations are saying, well, I want to start getting SBOMs from my customers. And we say, great, what would you do with them? The answers vary from, it's just going to sit in my email until I need it, to state of the art, which is I'm going to kind of file it in SharePoint and have it for some rainy day where I need it. And that's just not enough. You have thousands of vendors, thousands of SBOMs over the versions. You need a more systemic way to manage all of this, analyze your risk, and prioritize your risk for these third-party apps that you're not building yourselves, but are ultimately packaging or relying on. And the last most important piece I'll call out here, Cassie, is I think as an industry, when we think about risk, we've thought about practically vulnerability risk and license risk. I think what we are seeing is a shift around open source. There's a whole segment of what is being classified as next-gen supply chain attacks, name confusion attacks, not properly managed repositories of code, who are coding practices within these libraries that may not fit squarely as a vulnerability or a license, but they're leading indicators of potential problems you will encounter. And I think the important takeaway here is when you're building an SBOM program, really start thinking about what do you measure risk on? And there's a paper we published, we'll share a link here in the chat, around the top 10 open source software risks. For those of you that are interested, take a look. It was co-authored with 30 plus CISOs and CTOs as well. Now, putting all of this together, SBOMs are important. We need to figure out a great way to create them. I just want to kind of leave you with a cautionary tale on this. So as part of our research a few months ago, we looked at 3 very popular open source SBOM generators. And we said, let us understand the accuracy of these tools or similarities. Are they at least even consistent? Now, a couple of things to call out. One that we haven't had a chance to talk about, this is a short session, but happy to follow up, is there's different places in the life cycle of software development that you can build these SBOMs, right? You can do it right in your development process. You can do it once you're packaging your application, or you can do it once it's an image in a container. And what you see here with the colors, A, B, and C are the 3 tools. The purpose of this conversation wasn't really to try to call out, what these tools are. It's not a wall of shame, but it's education. The third tool actually couldn't even scan the Docker images. So that's why on 2.3, you don't see C. But if you notice down below the results, tool A had 94% false positives when you ran it in the software development process, but it got better as it became a container. Tool B had 35% false positives, and tool C actually had great precision. So you can read the full study. We'll give you a link here. But I want to leave you with this thing that, when you start thinking about an SBOM program, it's more than checking boxes. It's more than just grabbing an open source tool, running a bomb and saying, we're done. You really have to think about this as an end-to-end program that says, how do I bring in discipline and governance from the point when my developers are considering bringing you open source software? What do I look for? How do I analyze it? How do I approve or disallow it? And eventually, as we have a saying here at Endor Labs, open source software ages like milk, not wine. So you've got to maintain it. You've got to manage it. So does your program cover those components? You've got to remove it when it's no longer in use, as Cassie and I talked about. And eventually, hopefully that will get you to a point where when your BOM is available and ready, you feel great about it. You feel confident that you have all of the ingredients for success in the program. Cassie, I'll turn it over for you for any closing thoughts from you here.
Sure. And I'm going to comment. I really like this slide, but it points out that it especially is looking, again, at those open source software. And if you're purchasing a commercial library, some of those tools may not be able to inspect those commercial libraries very well. So there's a lot of layers to the SBOMs that you must really be able to, first off, have your teams verify, which I'm sure happened with this tool comparison. And from being able to really take this to a practitioner's perspective, I